Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is PJ Stevens. I'm the marketing manager here at SmartBear. Really excited to bring to you today a webinar called Taking the Complexity Out of REST API Testing. And we're going to show you how to do that with SoapUI Pro. We're at the SmartBear headquarters in Somerville, Massachusetts. And so we're really excited to bring you this webinar today. Just before we get started, let's meet our presenters. Harsha Preddy is our product marketing manager.
Hello, everybody. I'm good. Thank you, PJ.
Great. And Nathan Wright is our engineer.
Hi, everybody.
So Harsha will be walking us through some really interesting slides with a Lego theme today. So stay tuned for that. And Nathan will be showing us how to do all of these different things with REST APIs in SoapUI Pro. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. I already saw some questions about this in the chat box. Yes, the session is being recorded and we'll send it out via email, hopefully tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. Additionally, I'll share a really great resource if you're interested in learning more about testing REST APIs. It's our REST 101 ebook. I'll share that in the chat box. So be sure to check that PDF out. And definitely don't hesitate to ask us any questions. We're going to try to stick to the presentation just so we can have everyone follow along. But from time to time, we'll do our best to answer some questions that are relevant to the larger audience. So with that, I will kick it over to Hirsch to walk us through the agenda today.
Thank you, PJ. Really appreciate it. All right, so yeah, our agenda is going to be very varied. It's going to be ranging from the basics, that is basically basics of REST testing. We're going to talk about HTTP. We're going to break down REST and HTTP into components. We can see what you can test and what you should be testing. And then we're going to take all these components and we are going to be building REST tests with these individual components. Once we have talked about building test cases, we'll talk about how you can, on an ongoing basis, maintain these tests as your APIs change and you do more with your tests. And then there are some relatively advanced concepts like, hey, how can you do effective reporting on your API testing and how you can actually automate your REST API tests. Needless to say, we have Nathan here. He's our product expert, and he will be walking you through the product. Whatever we talk about, he will be showing you in the product. We have these slides basically for guidance, but we want you to learn more and more from in-product demo that we'll be doing here for you today.
And the goal here is to kind of level set initially, right? Make sure everybody understands what a RESTful service is, why it might be different from something like a SOAP service. And then we'll walk through things that we want to test, like what is in that request and response with a RESTful service. And then we'll get into the tool and start actually building something out. So yeah, some pretty cool stuff we're going to cover today.
Yep.
Great. Let's go ahead.
All right, so we're going to begin with the very, very basic building blocks of REST. A lot of you might be experts in API testing out there in the audience, but it's important for us to level set, as Nathan said, at the very beginning, exactly talking about what exactly is a REST API and how does it map to the HTTP protocol. So yes, so first of all, we thought it's a good idea for us to talk a little bit about HTTP and what goes on when you're actually doing stuff on your web applications or any application for that matter. A lot of communication over the internet these days goes through HTTP protocols. So if you're clicking on a web page, if you're entering a URL in a browser, or if you are actually hitting a REST API, you're doing communication over HTTP request and response. And HTTP works in pairs. You send a request and then you get a response. So this kind of is the very, very basic building block for your testing. So you will set up the scenario, you will set up the data as a part of the request, and you will then test the system's response to that information that you have initially set up in the request. So you will validate on your response whether it had a specific code or it had a specific data element set in that HTTP response. Okay, so having said that, having said that concept around HTTP, so how is REST and HTTP related, or how are they different, right? So the idea is that initially we had APIs like SOAP APIs, which were very complicated. So SOAP APIs were primarily driven by developers. They will write a method, and that method will result in a format of a WSDL file, and then testers will take that WSDL file and then they will create tests off of it. But then testers had no idea until the point that they saw WSDL that what's going on in the API, right? And then they would just take the WSDL, and there's going to be it was like a black box. They will take that WSDL, they will input it in the testing tool, and then that will result in some operations. And then they were like, okay, so these are the operations that's happening in that API, and then let's create tests around it. But REST is different. It is much more simple. It is much more transparent. So what REST does, it basically classifies all the operations and methods into some broader 4 categories. So I'm sorry. So you have a concept of resource in REST. So a resource could be an object that you are trying to manipulate, you're working with. And for example, in the slide that we have here, we have a pet as the resource. So what you can do is you can do different things with this pet. Well, first of all, if you have not added yet, you would probably add a new pet to your system, right? You can then modify that particular resource or that object. Then once you have done that, you may want to read it and do something with it, like display it on the screen, right? And maybe you want to delete some information as well. So REST maps out everything, every complicated functionality, and it says that you can achieve that advanced functionality through some basic operations like adding, modifying, reading, and deleting. And there was a beautiful coincidence that these methods already existed in HTTP. So HTTP already provides these key methods. HTTP provides a post method, a put method, get and delete method. So REST said, okay, we will use post for adding a resource or an object to the system. We will do a put to modify a resource or an object to the system. We'll read it using get, and we will delete it using the delete method, right? And on the right side, I have a few examples. So like the post to add a pet, there's a /pet resource. So in this case, you would, in the request body, you would set the content for the pet with all the information so that this pet can be added to the system. Similarly, for put, you still identify the resource using the /pet URL, and then you modify the content in the request body. Similarly, for get and delete, you identify that particular resource by an ID, and then you either retrieve it or you delete it. All right, so digging down a little bit deeper into REST and HTTP. Now we have established that, you know what, REST and HTTP have a pretty similar format. And if so as to be able to test REST, you need to know a little bit about HTTP protocol. All right. So having said that, let's take a deeper dive into what HTTP request and response looks like. So first of all, we have the method type. We talked about all the methods, get, post, delete, put. So that is what the method type is. And by the way, this request is a textual representation of information that is passing on the network when you are hitting an API. So in the API, when you are invoking an API, your browser, your application would create this kind of text, and it will transmit over your network, right? So this is how the REST API works. So in this case, the client or your browser is telling the server, I want to get a resource that is called pet on a version 2 API, and I want to find it by some status. And I'm passing that status information in that parameter at the end of that URL, in the endpoint. So you can see that we are able to identify resources by the endpoint. We are able to also send some information on the endpoint.
Yeah. One thing that I do like to mention here with this endpoint, you know, we've got a number of components essentially broken down within here. Essentially, at the very beginning, we have the domain itself. This is where the server lives, right? How we reach out and start to get information from it in this case. Right after that is the path of the resource that we're looking to access. And very common, this would be like -API, then a version number, and then we'd actually get into the meat of what we're looking to query for. In our case, it's pet data. We can see that we've got a nested resource here. So not only are we looking for this pet information, we're getting a specific by status kind of a collection of values. And then one thing that we're looking at here at the very end is something called a query parameter. So very common that we want to contextualize the request that we're making against this service. And we don't just want to get find by status, all of them, inactive and active. It makes more sense for the client and the actual kind of front end application to only get the data that it really wants. In this case, we could use something like a query parameter to define, okay, at this resource, which values do we want the server to return? The thing with these is that these have to be defined by the person designing or developing the API. This is what we go into the documentation and start to figure out and see, okay, at this resource, what kind of values can we start to pass and what actions can I start to perform how can we change the way that this service returns this data based on something like a query parameter. But we'll touch on that in more detail once we actually start sending some requests and responses. You want to go through headers here?
Yes, absolutely. Let's move on to the next area of the REST request. So yeah, so we have the method, we have the endpoint, and the second important thing that you probably look at a request when you are testing is are the headers. And it's important for you to understand because they exist and they're important. Why they're important? Because using headers, your client is doing some amount of housekeeping. They're telling server some information about what the request is all about. It tells you some metadata about the request, right? It'll tell you things like content length, okay, and then what the host is and what kind of connection over HTTP the client is using. Some information around like which kind of formatting they will be using, if there's any compression and everything. A lot of times, developers and designers may want to put information in headers. In our opinion, that's not the best practice. There's a lot of other places where you can put data. You should not have to create a custom header, but just saying that it is possible to have your own custom header that you can add to a request.
And we see headers used an awful lot for things like authorization values, session tokens and IDs, that kind of thing. You know, maybe I reach out to a specific resource or a service and essentially become authenticated on a network, and they would issue like a token to me, and all of my subsequent calls and requests, I would need to pass that token to essentially say, hey, this is who I am and how long I've been on the server. That is something that we typically see sent in a header, but as Serge mentioned, we don't want to send like a lot of data, where it's like we don't want to send a JSON kind of object in a header.
Yeah,
we have like a whole separate place for that. The other thing we do with headers is maintain sessions. So things like cookies and that kind of data is going to be stored up there, separated out from like the actual request values, but still sent so that the session could be maintained.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So speaking of data.
Yeah. So, so yeah, the data, if you're sending it on a request, and here is a GET request, you're just asking server for information. There is nothing for the client to send. But had it been a POST request, you would have sent some data in the request body. And that is where you put all your information. You can put as much data as you want in this request body. Sometimes if the data is too much, you can also do chunked data. You can send some part of it, and then again, the next request, you can send another part of it. So, but primarily all the information, object information, you would send in the request body in case you're transferring from the client to the server.
Great. One cool thing I learned recently, I always thought GET methods didn't support request bodies. I just didn't see the point, and I thought, well, if you're doing something with a body, there's better methods for it. Actually, reading through the specification or reading through the standards, GET does support bodies. So I was working with a group recently who was looking to essentially send like operation information through a GET request body, and it was kind of cool. I'd never seen it before, but yeah, there's plenty of stuff to know about HTTP requests and transactions. Great.
All right, talking about the response. So response has one of the most important components, which basically tells you what the response is, whether it's a normal response or it's an error, or maybe the resource that we talked about. You remember the pet in the last slide? That doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it has been deleted before. So depending on what the state is, this response code would vary. For example, here in this response, you were saying 200. So this basically means everything's fine. They were able to find that particular resource in the server, and it responded with the 200 OK code. Had the pet been deleted, the response would have been 404 or something on the 400 range of error codes. And there are other error codes like 500 that talk about the server errors, that maybe server has a problem or there is some code problem in the server, some exception that happened. So that will result some other error code. So testing would typically involve actually putting checks on this error code. We'll talk about assertions in the next slide, and we'll show you in the tool how you can put those checks. So you might say that, hey, I know that this particular pet exists in the server, and they should respond in a 200 OK error code, and I insist that happens. And if it doesn't happen, then my test case has failed. So this is how you would set it up. We'll talk about it. Yeah, again, headers and the response type. I think Nathan said a lot of things about the work of headers, session management, authorization, and all those things. So server also sends some information from the server side to the client side, and they will send all this metadata information in the headers. Again, it's up to you if you want to use headers for data, but you know what? There are a lot of other places where you can actually put data in a legitimate fashion and where people can find it and then parse it. So. And yeah, and finally, response body, most important piece of your response. So if you are sending some information back from the server to the client, that information would be contained in the response body. It could be an XML or a JSON, the most two popular formats. Here, what we are demonstrating here is in JSON format. So it tells you like, hey, we were able to get this particular pet, and the ID of the pet is 1045, and it's a category of dogs. So now client can get this information, and on the client side, there could be scripts, and there could be some system that would parse this information out and can do something with it, like displaying it on the screen.
So we kind of talked through what might have just happened here. Like we're talking about like a pet store, right?
Yeah.
So I would find by status, my status being like actively looking for homes or looking to be kind of purchased, whatever the pet's status is.
Yeah.
We would see like a response come back with like a whole list of different pets, probably just a list of IDs. And then if I clicked on one of these links in the front end that renders this out, we would make another RESTful request for this specific ID. So
Yes.
it will be like -pet-1045 in this case.
Yes.
We get a different set of data. We'd render that on the screen, and we kind of continue this process. So, RESTful is all about this request response cycle and being explicit in what we're asking for, but also the server having the flexibility to kind of understand a number of different types of requests that we can serve to it. Just break this down.
Absolutely. So exactly. So we have talked about all these components. Here are some examples. So endpoints will look like these two examples that we have here. One of my favorite APIs is Spotify, and pretty much open. You can just hit it to get your information, log in with authorization, and get your playlists and whatnot that you have used in Spotify. Query parameters, we talked about it, like they will be appended at the end of the endpoint to send more information. We talked about headers. Request body could be XML and JSON, a couple of examples out there. And similarly on the response side, we have status code. We talked about the 404 error, the not found status code, and 500 error code that would happen if in case your server is in fault. There's some error out there.
That's what you don't want to see.
That's what you don't want to see. Yeah, exactly. If you get that, then definitely it's a failed test case.
It's a lot of failed things.
Exactly. Talking about response headers, there's a lot of things, including setting cookies, and the response body. It could be a JSON and with a lot of information. All right, demo time out here. So
got me again. So yeah, let's take a look at what this actually looks like and build a request in SoapUI. Again, just kind of level set and make sure everyone's familiar if you haven't seen the tool before with how essentially we kind of have request and response.
Can I make a quick comment? So yeah, please feel free to ask us questions on the chat or the questions box. So we are here to answer any questions you have, simple or advanced. We'll try our best to answer your questions. Thank you.
Yeah, questions. Great way to kind of guide what we're doing today. We have an agenda, but we're not locked into it by any stretch. So definitely feel free. Let me just move this back to the same. There we go. All right, so on the screen now we should see, and we do see, Ready API. This is SmartBear's API testing tool. Today, obviously, we're talking mainly about functional testing, validating that an API, responds in the correct format, gives us the correct data when we ask for it. That's a functional test, right? And we do that in our tool called SoapUI Pro. We can see that right across the top. Nice thing with Ready API, that the platform that we're working in, we can take that session, that functional test that we build, and essentially reuse it in something like a security test, or maybe we run it at scale, distribute it across multiple machines. It's going to be load UI. This last piece is pretty cool, especially if we're exploring something like a RESTful service. Maybe I have a SOAP service that exists. Maybe I have an existing API, and we're looking to make a new one. And we want to just have like a sandbox for us to work in and kind of play around. And I don't want to have to write code and do that kind of work. What I can actually do with a tool like ServiceV is build a mock API very, very quickly through a point and click interface, stand up essentially a mimic version of what is actually hopefully going to be developed, and start to interact with that, get responses, contextualize it, add logic. Really, really neat tool if we are looking at something like building RESTful services. At the end of the day, the core of the tool is sending a request, getting a response, right? So REST it's the same kind of idea. We want to interact with that server as a client and validate that the data is being returned in the right way. When we look at doing this in SoapUI, let's just grab a quick example here with something like Google Maps. Just give me 1 second. And we can do this a couple of different ways. Once we actually get into creating a session and doing things like passing IDs and doing some data-driven testing, we're going to use this definition file. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves. For now, we just showed off the different parts of a URL. So let's go ahead and just grab a URL for us to build a request with. And anybody who's played around with RESTful APIs, chances are you've interacted with this one. It's Google Maps. Very, very popular. Also free up to a certain point. So nice one to demo. But we're just going to create a new service here within the tool. It's just going to ask us to copy paste this URL down. We can see that I've included the endpoint. The resource path here is going to come right after it. And then finally, just a single query parameter asking for a specific address here. So we can see in our case, we're interacting with the API. We're accessing the geocode resource. So I'm looking for essentially address information here. I'm also asking for a specific format. And in this case, it's XML. We'll see when we hit OK. The tool is going to be split essentially down the center. We've got on the left side request data. This is how we build and send the request. And on the right is where we're going to render out the response that comes back from the API. We can see that this table has been created down here. And this is going to map out values up to these top fields. So something right now like my address parameter, we can see that I can start to update this table. The value up here in the parameter path is changing. So very, very easy for us to start to get some different responses back from the server this way and just switch between some of these different inputs. Another nice thing here, we can build on top of this. So for example, I copy pasted my URL in, and then I'm reading through documentation and I realized there's like 10 other query parameters that are available here. As opposed to like copy pasting or trying to build a request that ticks all those boxes, we can essentially just add rows to this table. We use this style column to define where the value is getting passed into, in this case, query. But now we can start to actually update the information and the data that we're asking the server for. This could be an optional parameter. We can see we can remove that. Really, really powerful piece of what we're doing here. Another thing we can do is start to contextualize the resource path. So maybe, I want to have my XML test running and I want to validate this, but I also want to validate JSON data as well. One of the nice things we can do, as opposed to creating like a whole nother set of resources within our tool, is just create a pretty much a dynamic variable that gets passed in. So this style now I can change to a template, get rid of that hard-coded value, and we can see we've got this new format variable stored up top. And when we run this and look at the raw request, table is just being read here and that value plugged in. So now we've got pretty much what we were looking at with Hershey's slides. We've got the method over here, get request. We've got the endpoint resource query parameter. We've got the protocol. The header is down here at the bottom, and obviously we're not sending any kind of body. But then on the right-hand side of the screen, exactly what we expected. We're getting a response from the API. It's giving us that 200 OK. It's giving us some data about the session and kind of what's going on. But it's also giving us that response body. And this is really what we're focused on right now, making sure that this data is correct, it's accurate with what I asked for, it's formatted in the right way, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, just a quick introduction there, building a request within the tool, getting a response. Remember, we're not doing any assertions right now. It's still essentially manual testing. But we can build on this now that we've got this request working. We can bring this in and start to build validations on top of that.
Absolutely. Cool. Thank you, Nathan.
Yeah.
All right, moving on. So let's talk about, after we have set up the context around HTTP and basically REST, what is REST? We talk about request and response, different components of it. Let's talk about how you can actually start building API tests. So there are majorly 4 different ways of doing it. You can do it through endpoints. Endpoints are basically the URL and the resource identifiers that we talk about. So you can send a request to the endpoint and record the response, right? And then you can say, okay, this response contains the right error code, or you may want to parameterize different data elements in the response. That is one way of doing it.
It's kind of what we just saw.
We just saw, right? Other way is you can record it. So there's a very cool feature in SoapUI under the API that kind of enables you to record all the APIs behind your website. So you can record all the APIs, you can filter all the get, put, post responses, requests, and then you can create tests directly from it. We'll show that to you. Third way is somebody might just give you a text file or transaction file and say, hey, you know what, we did some kind of operations on our website and this is what happened. And can you please ensure that you test it really well? So you can take that file, you can import it into the tool, and then you can create tests off of it. So we saw that textual representation of request and response. That is what this file contains. And the tool is able to parse it and put them together as a test. And finally, and the best way for you to do it is through API design definitions, specifications and definitions. And here, the most popular specification is the Open API specification. It's worth exploring, and it is built for REST. It gives you all the, so your designer for the API can actually go in a tool like Swagger Hub, and they can actually design these APIs. They can define the parameters, they can define the data elements and everything. So it's kind of a definition of an API, and once you have the definition set, you can take the definition of this RESTful API, and then you can directly import it into your tool, and then SoapUI tool, and then you can just create tests off of it. It makes things very simple because it's a central source of truth. So if your developers change something in the future, you just have to get the updated version and change your tests. We'll talk more about how to do that in the subsequent slides.
So yeah, I think this definition file is important. It solves a problem that I think RESTful services have, that, if we don't have somebody who's committed to documentation, or we aren't explicit in what the API can do, no one's going to understand how to use it. And at that point, we've created something that's not very useful. When we have something like a definition file, like Hirsch just said, it's a source of truth. If the API doesn't fulfill the functions defined in that definition, then it's not up to snuff and it doesn't do what we expect. It also means that we can use it to test against. Like, we know exactly what the resources, the parameters, what the responses should look like. It's literally defined for us. So we can use that to start creating our tests against. Really, really powerful way to get up and running, something that was inherent in SOAP services. And I think the Open API specification is a very good way to kind of get that functionality with RESTful services as well. I think it's interesting, I know we won't talk about it too much, but like GraphQL, this is kind of a baked-in part of it as well, isn't it? It's like you define operations and mutations and things in there. Absolutely. It's part of the service.
Absolutely. A lot happening in the space,
right.
API space, RESTful API space. Yeah.
This definition is really important.
All right.
Cool. Right.
Yeah, let's talk about a little bit about assertions. So I think assertions it's a pretty fairly common concept in testing. So you are actually asserting on a condition, like the response. In this case of an API, you're asserting the response data should contain some information. It should look like a particular well-defined structure. And you can do that through different types of assertions. So here we are covering just a few of many, many available assertions in SoapUI Pro. And in the tool, we will see the others. But you can categorize them into some basic assertions like contains. So it basically checks if your response that comes from your server, and now you know what response means. It's that JSON at the bottom that we showed to you earlier. If that contains a specific string or text element, you may want to check the HTTP response codes. So you know that there is a resource that exists on the server side, and you want the response to be 200 OK, because if you're sending the right request, it should be 200 OK response. So you want to assert on that particular response code. So you can do that. Similarly, you can put checks on HTTP headers. And then there are a little bit advanced assertions like JSON path assertions. So these depend on the concept of JSON path. So you can define a structure of a JSON in a single string, and that determines the check whether the response is similar to the structure that you have defined. So it will, so for example, JSON path match would check if element in the JSON structure is equivalent to what you have defined. So it will assert that. Similarly, you can count the number of elements in the JSON responses using the JSON path count assertion. So if you're expecting 5 pets to be responded to you, and if the response is just 4, that'll be a failure of the test case.
And I like to mention JSON path match. While functionally sounds similar to something like contains, it is different. It is important to make that distinction. Something like a contains assertion is just going to make sure, okay, somewhere in the response does this value exist. Mm-hmm. JSON path match is saying explicitly at this location is this value X. So yeah, definitely use cases for both and either. But that JSON path kind of option is definitely an important one to start digging into. And you'll find XPath is very similar for XML, essentially just a way to target like specific values and specific positions within a response or a JSON object, I guess, in general. Great.
Awesome. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about how you can take all these concepts. So there are a couple of questions which talk about, hey, we have these URLs and these steps. What do we do with this? What's the next step? So next step is once you have figured out what your resources are, or what your endpoints are, what your requests and responses are, then what you can do is you can take these elements and based on your function requirements, you can create some scenarios out of it. Like for example, here we have a scenario in which a user is logging into the system. The user is adding a pet, and then they're checking the status of the pet, whether that was added correctly, and then they're logging out. So all of these are REST API calls. So you are collecting these REST API calls into these test steps, as we call in SoapUI inside a test case. And then once you've done that, you can actually start running the test case.
Right, and we want these scenarios to recreate the way somebody or service might interact with our API, right? So it's not like somebody's not going to log in to start getting data out of a service. That's something that we want to recreate and make sure functionally we're passing data. We're kind of doing things the way that they're actually going to happen in production. So yeah, that's definitely why we built out, these sandwich steps.
So once you have the basic scenario set up, what you can do is you can actually factor out some common information. So what you're doing is you're creating a state for this scenario. You're saying that, okay, everything in the scenario, all the API calls will share a common username and password. And maybe I just want to work with a single pet name that is Misty here, and I want to store it in as a property. And that makes my life a little bit easier because I don't have to specify the pet name, username, password every time I do or set up a test step. I can just refer to the property value. And if in case that property value changes, for example, Misty changes to some other name of the pet, then automatically you have that reflected in your test steps across the different scenarios. So you can make your test scenarios more dynamic by adding properties, and we'll see that more in the demo going forward. Okay, and another step that you can add to your test case is that you can actually pull a lot of information that you want to test from a data source. And when I say data source, I mean things like an Excel sheet or a database that you can connect through JDBC in the SoapUI case. So what you can do is you can log in the scenario, and then what you're doing is you're iterating on this data source elements, which are basically number of rows in your Excel sheet. And one by one, you are running those test cases for each and every pet name here. So you have the first pet name, you are adding it, checking the status, and you're coming back and looping it all over again for the second pet name. So it is useful because you may have a situation in which you have a business analyst who is expert in kind of setting up all the different scenarios for your business application. So you can ask that person to set up this data source for you. They can fill in that Excel sheet, and then you can give it to your team to plug it into your tests, and they can just run it. So kind of enables you separation of concerns. It also enables you to run many scenarios in a very short period of time. So we are kind of now going into automation territory, right? So we are moving on doing more and more testing, more and more scenarios in lesser amount of time using some really, really good productivity tools that SoapUI Pro provides.
We can also do things like have like a whole set of like edge cases, and then as we discover new ones and we want to kind of build out further kind of parts of that, as opposed to creating new test cases, which is heavy and takes time, we could just add a couple rows to our Excel sheet, and the next time whatever test case it took up to runs, it's going to have all that new data to kind of parse through. Really important concept and a great way to essentially extend work that's already been done around something like a kind of functional test case. One other thing I see data sources used all the time for is essentially like, maybe we make a post request and we want to create something on the web service. Maybe we want to get that by ID as well and validate that it exists. We could also query, the database that stores that information as well and validate that it's formatted in the right way and that kind of thing. So it's not only a way to drive our test, but it's also a way to validate that the action that the server is meant to perform has been done correctly. But yeah, we can talk a little bit more about that. All right.
Okay, second demolition.
second demolition. And break everything I did before. Any questions coming in? I did see one over your shoulder that I'm curious to answer. Or
absolutely. So we have a few questions coming in, and well, there's one question. Make Joseph is asking around so is web services and APIs, are they interchangeably used terms, or what's
the difference? Yeah, that's a good question. That's the one I wanted to answer.
Okay, cool.
Web services have APIs, right? So a web service exists. It could be something that interacts with a bunch of stuff. It could be something that's siloed out. Essentially, the API is a part of it, and it's how we communicate with that web service. So they are kind of separated, or not separated out, but they share a lot of the same kind of positioning, but they are also explicit and different from one another. That's a good question.
Yeah, so Jagdishan wants to ask how to perform these steps. So that's where we are at this point of time. We'll show you step by step how to actually create that scenario from raw RESTful API calls, request and responses.
Right. That other one as well. Can we pass request parameters, that kind of thing? We'll do that. We'll build out that test case right now and take a look at how we do that with our tool. Terrific. So let's just close this up. And as I mentioned, I want to use this Swagger pet store as an example today. We can perform actions like logging in and essentially creating here without having to worry about interacting with this Google Maps site. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump over into SoapUI. Again, this is the space where we actually build out these tests. We're going to create a new test suite here. SoapUI projects contain test suites. Test suites are collections of test cases. Test cases contain individual test steps, which are things like RESTful requests, SOAP requests, data source connections. And we iterate through those sequentially. In our case, let's create a new test suite here for post pet. There we go. From this point, we're going to create a new test case as well. Full session, let's call it. All right, and now what we want to do is just open up that same view. In our case, this API navigator is going to give us access to all of the different actions and kind of resources that we can start to perform. So we know that we want to create a new pet. We want to use a post method, but first we need to log in. We see that we have a resource here to do just that. This is probably something that I'd read through my documentation and figure out. In our case, it's just a GET request. So we can just click and drag this up now into my test case. Let's call this login. And when we open this up, a couple of things that we can do here. Just like we were talking about before, we have the request on the left-hand side, and we'll get a response on the right. One thing that Hirsch mentioned that is important to kind of think about and want to set up, these values right here, right? These are essentially my login values, and this is how I'm going to initiate a session with the server. Right now, these are hard-coded into this request. So if I wanted to make a new test case or a new test suite or maybe 10 new test suites, every single time that I perform this login step, I'm going to have to make sure I have these correct values. If we change this, if the server loses all of its data and we have to recreate this, then these values might change. If we have 10 different test cases, that's an absolute nightmare to maintain. So this is a perfect place to start thinking about moving data to a slightly higher level. In our case, we have a concept of properties. So let's grab the username here, just cut that. When I look at the project, just select it here. We have a custom property option. So I could just say username, copy paste, and then let's say my super secret password here. Custom properties, this is password. Now, not only is it sorted, it's being, if I save the project, it actually encodes the password when I save it as a password property. Now we've got these empty fields. Okay, so how do we get this data? Our tool makes it very easy to essentially reference things like properties and data from previous test steps through what we call property expansion. We see that we could manually build this out using the syntax that this is written in, but we actually have a menu that we can pull up and essentially build that property expansion string for us. The button on the right-hand side gives us what we call a Get Data menu. We can see that we have access to essentially the project that we're working in, and that's the test suites, test cases, individual test steps we'll talk about in a second. Right now, we know that we want to grab a project property. We see those are defined right up at the top here. So we'll grab our username, go ahead and grab the password here. And now because we've created these references, even if I had 100 other test cases and they all had these references, there's only one place that I have to maintain this data, and that's my custom properties. So really, really powerful piece of what we're trying to introduce with a tool like SoapUI. All right, so go ahead, run the request. We should see we don't get anything from the server because it's not running. There we go. So now let's run the request, and we get a response back on the right-hand side. In our case, it's a JSON format, and it's issuing us a token here. So we've, initiated a session. If we look at the headers, we can see the server is saying, okay, we're tracking how many requests you make, and we're also making sure at such and such a time this session ID is going to be invalid. So we've created this login step now, and we're ready to kind of move on. The next thing that we want to do is actually make a post call and create something on the against the API. So to do that, what was it? -pet and then post.
Yes.
There we go. And now we've got the request. I just click and drag it up here. Let's call this create pet. Perfect. And we can see here now that we've got essentially a post body. And this is the object that we want to pass to the server, have it validate that it's in the right format and it contains the data we need, and then it's going to store it in its database and send back to us, hopefully something that looks identical, but maybe with an ID. We can see up at the top here, we have a field for authorization, and remember that we were issued that token. So let's go ahead and first create a reference to that using our login step. We know that we want to grab data from the response. The session token came back in the response body. So when we hit add, we can see that we access that now. And the JSON path that we were talking about earlier, depending on where I click in this menu, is going to be resolved for us. So we just click OK. And just like before, it's created this property expansion syntax for us. So super straightforward, whether it's accessing it from a property, from a previous response. Very, very easy for us to start to grab these values. Cool. So let's say that we've got something down in here. Here we go. Run the request. We see we get a response back on the right-hand side, and the service has issued us a token or an ID defining how and where this value is stored, and it's pretty much just reflecting exactly the request that I just sent. So validating essentially that the service has created the data, and it's rendering out that it matches what I sent. One thing to note with something like a post call, we do have a different status code, so maybe we want to add an assertion for that. Actually, I don't know. Do we want to talk about assertions now, Hirsch? I'm getting...
Maybe, yeah. Let's just show the different assertions that we have.
Sure.
We talked about that, so I think it makes sense for us to show it.
Okay.
Assertions.
So yeah, a couple of ways that we can add assertions within our platform. There's a whole menu, about 30 of these built right into the tool. Things like we spoke about before, contains, JSON path matches, validating things against like a definition file. HTTP header equals, we could input a bunch of different values here. All of these are going to be rolled into the tool right out of the box. So really, really easy to configure. Maybe something like my HTTP header setting. I can just add that, say, actually, I didn't want to do that. Just remove that one. I wanted to add the status code. There we go. There we go. Valid HTTP status codes. And in this case, I know 201 is the only valid status code for this this action. So we can see now we're passing the assertion. The API responded the way I expect. Really, really easy to do. If we're talking about validating things like the actual data in the response, we do have a nicer way to do that, and that's using our outline editor. Maybe I want to check to make sure something like this ID exists. All I have to do is right-click, add an assertion here, and we've got a couple options. So right now we'll choose existence. We'll talk about doing this for content in just a second. JSON path is resolved for us. Passing value, we can hit save. Everything's passing. So the API is performing exactly like I expect now, and we're going to validate that on every subsequent call. Great. So I think if we think back to that session, the next step was to essentially make an API call to validate that the server is going to respond if we ask for a specific ID with the right data. To do that, we're going to get pet by ID. So just like we talked about initially, we have this action here. We can grab this request object, move it up, and we'll say get pet. Now, we do this by the ID. Let's first take care of this authorization value. So we do this by the ID, and we know that that came back in that previous response. So why don't we just grab the data from there and use that in our initial request? When we start talking about expanding this and doing something like a data-driven test, removing things like hard-coding values becomes even more important and expedites this process even further. So we can see that I can just open this up here. We've seen this menu used a bunch of times now, but I just select the step that I want to pull this information from. In our case, we know that we're grabbing this from the response, so we can add that. And we're just going to grab the ID here. We can see that right across the top, we've now passed in that ID from that previous call. And when I run this, we should see that there we go. The API responds with that correct ID. So this is another place we might want to think about adding a validation. Let's say in our ID, we want to add an assertion here for the content. And this dynamic field, we can actually right-click, use the Get Data menu to create a reference to something like the request ID. So the one that I'm actually passing in, we can use as a validation. Really, really cool. Super straightforward. All right. Last thing we do is just log out. So let's just move that up. And in just a few clicks, we've recreated what a typical user might do within our API. We've logged in, we've issued a token, we've passed that in subsequent calls, we've created a new pet, we validated that it exists on the API or on the server, and then we've logged out and pretty much just shut down the session. So all done through a point-and-click interface, things like that JSON path references and finding specific data points, all done through our point-and-click menu here. It's a really nice way to start building out RESTful test cases and to start building out validations against an API. So I know we've got 10, 15 minutes left. We want to take a look at data-driven components?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we should move on in the agenda, and let's come back to data-driven if in case we have time towards then, which I think we'll have a few minutes towards then to cover
Okay,
as well.
yeah, we can do that. Let's crank through some slides.
Absolutely.
Cool.
All right, so yeah, another important component is that once you have your advanced test scenarios created, it may happen that your APIs will change, and they will change. APIs will change every day sometime. Day by day, you have your developers updating your parameters, your URLs, a lot of things change over the course of time. So how do you actually maintain those tests? So we'll talk about this a little bit. So refactoring is something that is supported really well in API and SoapUI. So what you can do is you can take the updated definition of your API and you can bring it to your tool, and then you can actually compare them side by side to see what has changed, and you can selectively bring those updates into your tests. So I've been using the word specification definition because it makes a lot of sense to use specification if you're using refactoring, because specification has that structure already built in, and it makes it easy for the tool to parse the changes, the delta between what it was before and what it is right now, and help you bring those changes into your test cases. So that's why we set up that if you're creating tests, then the best practice is use definitions and specifications like OpenAPI specification. Collaboration, yes. So you can actually collaborate on your API testing. So you can actually use Git and SVN to check in your tests. You can actually, on the same project, you can have multiple people working on different parts, different test cases, different test steps, different test suites, and they can all collaborate and work on those things at the same time. So you can do parallel work in different parts of your test scenario. So that enables you to get a lot of input from your peers, from your coworkers. It enables you to share your work with other folks over your repository, and it enables you to work in parallel as well. So definitely we have that support in SoapUI as well. Quickly, you want to note on reporting and automation in SoapUI. Well, we have exhaustive reporting capabilities in SoapUI Pro, so you can not only generate reports in different formats, you can also view your test history. So we have a really colorful and very useful dashboard, which gives you information around what you did in the past. And even inside SoapUI, you have very detailed test results stored from your test runs from the past. So you can take a test run and you can set it as a baseline. You can say, yeah, this is my best test run ever, and everything else will be compared to that baseline test run. And you can do all these reporting capabilities, comparison, baselining in SoapUI Pro. analyzing your history and test results as well. And finally, automation. So yeah, so automation, as you can see in this graphic, well, a lot of APIs could come as a definition. It could come from different API management tools. It could be an API test suite that you have created. And once you have created these functional tests, security tests, and performance tests, that is what the whole Ready API suite enables you to do. What you can do is you can also create virtual API environments. A lot of times you are actually hitting an API which is belonging to a third party. So this third party API might not be available all the time because it might be under development or it's expensive to invoke. So what you can do is you can create these virtual API environments for your testing. And you can take all of these environments and your tests, and then you can just put it on different automation frameworks like Bamboo, Jenkins, and Maven. And this is how a lot of our customers and a lot of our prospects, they plug into their DevOps cycle. They do continuous testing. They can start doing this testing while they're actually writing code. They can build these tests upfront because they don't depend on a third-party API or their own APIs because they are able to create those virtualized environments. So this kind of weaves into the whole DevOps process. So just giving in context, and just wanted to convey the point that yes, the Ready API and SoapUI tooling provides you the capability of building automated test environments and plugging into your continuous integration, continuous testing, or DevOps lifecycle environments as well.
Cool. So 10 minutes left. Why don't we go through data-driven components and talk a little bit maybe about automation here. And I guess if there's any questions, we can field those. Great. So as we've been following along here, we've created this session, right? And at this point, we've got some flexibility. We've kind of abstracted out things like our login values, and we've created references across these subsequent steps for things like those IDs that the API is responding with. So we're like 50% of the way there, I think. It's getting to the point where it's kind of dynamic, but it's still requiring us essentially inputting some fixed values into this initial call. What we can do with the data-driven piece is essentially hook this up to something like an Excel sheet that has all these values, maybe has our validations in as well. And then we could just continue to add rows and just build things out from that data source. As an example, we are going to use Excel here, so I'm just going to add a step in the tool for a data source. A number of these that we can connect to. So as I mentioned today, Excel, but this could be something like a data connection to a database. This could be something like a previous response. Maybe I get an array of objects back and I want to use those in post calls or patch methods or something. Very easy to do with like a JSON data source or an XML for some different nodes here. So we do have a lot of options. With the Excel, let's just take a look at the file here. Super straightforward. All we've got going on is we've got some input values. We see those going kind of across here. Pet IDs, pet types, tags. And then this final column is expected. So this is the data that I expect the API to return, not anything that I'm actually kind of inputting. We want to go row by row here and essentially run 6 different versions of this and make sure everything's happening properly. And in this way, we could just build another 100 of these and just continue to iterate through without maintaining the actual test case itself. All we have to do, just browse that file on my local machine here. There we go. Import the properties. This is just going to grab the headers, store them as something that we can reference. And then when we run the request, we should see all the data from that Excel sheet has been brought down, stored in a row column format within the tool. Now, because we know how property expansion works, we can just create references to these properties in subsequent calls, and this will resolve into actually the values that are in each row. So to do that, we've kind of seen these steps. We're going to open up the inputs here, and let's say we just want to do this with the names. Just right-click, get data. We'll grab the data source, the pet name here. You can see we can add that. The property expansion has been inputted. So maybe we'll just do this with our ID as well. Get data, data source, so tag 1. Might as well just do this too. Cool. So now we've kind of inputted all the data that we need. Let's go ahead, run the request and see what this looks like. Pet type ID. All right. Just want to make sure my service is running here. All right. So now we run the request. We look at the raw request going out. And we should have seen some values being passed in there. Just one second. I imagine it's because I'm just kind of hanging around here with all these different strings and syntaxes. It's going to pulling the data in here. Apologies, this worked right before the session. It's strange. Anyway, here's what I made earlier. All right, so run the request. We're passing in some data from the data source here, and then we're getting a response back. There we go. So now we can see that we're passing in values here, essentially into the request. We're getting a response from the API on the right-hand side. We've seen where we want to use, the ID from the previous call as a validation. So all we'd want to do here is ask for that specific ID. I can't believe it didn't work. And then we could use that data source in our validations as well. So here we can see I can just right-click, add an assertion here, as opposed to accessing data from a previous call or anywhere else. This can just come from that data source. So this could be expected values. This could be validating the name that we inputted. Creating that connection and then maintaining that data source is going to be a really great way to scale coverage or something like that with very little maintenance on the actual test case. Last thing that I'll point out here is how we automate this process. Essentially from within our tool, we can right-click at any point, bring up what we call the test runner. This is a configuration for how this runs outside of the UI. Things like the types of reports, where they should be stored, environments that should be executed against. As soon as we hit the launch button, the tool is giving us here a script that we're able to use to run this now from the command line, from Jenkins, from Maven, from Bamboo. Wherever it is that we want to start to run this from, we can do it from this, this command line argument. So apologize for the data source there kind of failing us at the very end. I imagine it's just because I have two of these kind of working against each other. Hopefully we communicated the value in using something like a data-driven test, and hopefully we can see how we could start to automate this process as well using that right-click menu. So a couple minutes left. I don't know, Hirsch, any questions other than?
Yeah, there are a lot of questions. I think we should take them. So yeah, there are a bunch of questions around like differences between REST and SOAP. And this is an interesting question again from Megan. She's asking, how secure do you think is REST APIs when compared to SOAP services?
Yeah. Not as secure. I think by nature, SOAP services are, they define exactly what they do, how they do it. They list it in a definition, and then you got to follow those rules. There's also, the whole kind of envelope that comes with a SOAP service, which includes a lot of authorization. There's a lot of good solutions out there for RESTful services and authorization, but because it's dynamic by nature and it has this this mentality of being flexible, there's always room when developing for kind of flaws and issues to be exposed. And we actually do a really good job with the platform here, being able to take something like this session this average user might kind of go through, and actually moving that into what we call a penetration test or a security testing space, and trying to pass in a bunch of SQL arguments with the login values and seeing what happens to the API when we do that, and making sure if we do create any issues that we plug those up before we promote this to something like a production environment. So yeah, it's a good question. And
absolutely. So there are a bunch of other questions. There is Kelly has a question around on the webinar. Do you have a webinar on Secure Pro? And then there's a question by Pradeep, and he wants to know about database mocking. So just want to say that we keep this cadence of webinars ongoing. So in future, stay tuned to our emails. You will see webinars on security testing for APIs. You'll also see webinars for virtualization and mocking. So stay tuned. We will have very, very in-depth webinars on each of these topics in the future as well.
I'm also going to take this chance to plug the Academy. So
Yes.
we operate an Academy here at SmartBear, training for anybody who wants it. Ready API 101 is going to be an hour-long introduction to our tool. It's all just how do we use Ready API and what's going on the screen here. We do cover a little bit of security testing in that, but it's the SoapUI 201 that we really get into secure. Anyone interested in database mocking, tune into either the Service V 201 or 301 classes, and that's when I cover that. So yeah, those run, I don't know, every month or every couple months. We've got resources on the website as well. So yeah, definitely opportunities and definitely ways to kind of get that information.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank Hirsch and Nathan for taking the time today. I think that was a really great session. I think everybody learned a lot. It was really cool to get into the tool as well. Definitely check out our website, smartbear.com. We've got a pretty comprehensive resource section there. So you'll be able to check out upcoming webinars that we have, different ebooks and different articles, as well as our SmartBear Academy classes that Nathan's referencing. So definitely check those out. They're all free. Sign up, regardless of whether you're a customer of the tool or not. Happy to walk you through how it works. And just a reminder that we'll be sending out the recording of this session within the next 48 hours. So stay tuned for that via email. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. Have a great day.